So, hello there. As the title of the lecture indicates, we're going to start talking about vertical datums. However, we do need to wrap up our discussion of horizontal datums, and in particular, horizontal datums based on NAD83. We just finished talking about introducing NAD83, its development, some of the problems with NAD83 on its inception and release, as well as some of its successes. So NAD83 is useful. It is applicable. It's practical. It's a good datum. You know, we still use it until the next one, if it ever comes out. So let's look at some specific NAD83 based datums. So NAD83 based datums. So even though NAD83 is a datum in and of itself, it's essentially a framework or a system by which we can develop other datums, or expand on NAD83 to enhance the qualities to get more effective datums. One of those is, hopefully you've heard of all of these, but we have it's a whole system of high accuracy reference networks, or HARNs. You've probably heard the term HARN. So high accuracy reference networks are they're developed either state by state. So states develop their own HARN, or they're regional, right? They might incorporate more than one state, or there might be several HARNs within a state depending on the size of the state. And HARNs were developed with the intent to improve upon the framework of NAD83. So it's an accuracy, they were developed as an accuracy upgrade. To NAD83. Coordinates. And it was developed using GPS. And if you remember from the last discussion, NAD83 was developed using terrestrial means, so total stations, triangulation, level loops. The HARNs were intended to incorporate GPS technology to increase the accuracy, since with the advent of NAD83, GPS technology became ubiquitous. It became democratized, and more professionals were using GPS technology. So something had to be done to make it more reliable, since GPS gives us, across vast expanses, more accurate and precise results. So HARNs, and since I'm in Oregon, I'm going to talk about Oregon's HARN. So the Oregon HARN is a statewide datum that was developed. So if I draw a picture, I'll draw a picture kind of Oregon. This is kind of Oregon, a little wider. And in Oregon, we have these mountains, a mountain range called the Cascade Mountains. Now, west of the Cascade Mountains, we have
the Willamette Valley, and then the Coast Range. And overall, west of the Cascade Mountains, we have a lot more gradient change. So we need a more densely populated set of control points. So the Oregon Harn on the west side of the Cascades, monuments were set up intending to be roughly 25 kilometers apart. So the goal was to have, for each monument in the ground, there was another monument that was no more than 25 kilometers away. On the east side of the Cascades, it's mostly high desert. It's the Columbia River Basin. We have some mountains up in the northeast and the southeast, but for the most part, it's much flatter. Less gradient change overall, at least comparative to the west side of the Cascades. So on this side, since setting up these networks is very costly, we were able to develop a set of Harn stations that were 50 kilometers apart without compromising accuracy or precision. So elevation has a profound effect on the accuracy of points in the ground. So let me just wrap up this. So 25 kilometer stationing and 50 kilometer stationing. And this is not the same use of the word stationing like we use in route surveying. This is simply stations, meaning a Harn station, a point in the ground that's managed for the purposes of surveying. There's a few problems with the Oregon Harn system. I'm not sure about other states, but in Oregon, one of the problems is that the stations, I'll say Harn stations, just to be consistent. So Harn stations tend to be in undesirable locations. That is, undesirable for practical surveying. So some of those limitations are they are on mountaintops. Otherwise, another problem is that a lot of them are otherwise difficult to get to, so difficult to access. Another problem with Oregon's Harn system is that we have a lot of trees. So sky coverage, or sky, I'll say openness, is a challenge. And we all know that for GPS surveying, or nowadays GNSS surveying, we need, to a lesser extent than was the case back when the Harns were being developed. Of course, now we have the L1, L2, and L5 frequencies that we can access the entire constellation of the GNSS network, all of the Russian constellation, Chinese constellation, European, our own constellation. So sky coverage is becoming less and less of a concern, but when this was being developed, most of the GPS surveying was static and only utilized L1, so the GPS satellite network, or the constellation. So sky openness was a real problem, whereas now we kind of take for granted that if we go out with an L5 capable system, I can get good GPS results, really good tight GPS results in some pretty dense canopy cover. I keep testing that and I keep coming up with successful results. So, but still, sky openness is necessary, and Oregon has a lot of challenges to that effect. So it should be pointed out that the Oregon Harn system or network, the Oregon Harn network, is horizontal only. So it's two-dimensional, being a horizontal network, and did not incorporate elevations. So HARNs, high accuracy reference networks. Another system that was developed based on NAT83 is WGS84, which is its own system. So WGS84 uses its own ellipsoid. So it uses the WGS84 ellipsoid. So not GRS80, although they are very, very, very closely related. We can go out in small regions, we go out and use the WGS84 ellipsoid, not see really monumentous differences between the GRS80 ellipsoid. So it has its own ellipsoid. And it's used by the military. So the military uses WGS84. It's also used for satellite tracking and constellation maintenance. So satellite, I'll put and positions, which is kind of like the tracking, but we report satellite positions in WGS84. What else? Okay, so it's frequently updated. So using a WGS84 realization is going to give you the most up-to-date result, at least more up-to-date than NAT83. Finally, so that's WGS84. And all of these, I'll say, so for WGS84 specific state HARNs, the parameters of those frameworks are really easy to access. So you can just Google WGS84 and you can see what the parameters are to use in a system. So WGS84. And one final datum I want to talk about that's based on NAT83 is the International Terrestrial Reference Framework. And you're probably used to seeing that as ITRF. Opus always provides ITRF coordinates, and there's a reason for that. So currently, ITRF is used in the civilian world. So unlike WGS84 that's primarily used in the satellite maintenance and in military environments. The ITRF is used frequently in the civilian world, as well as other arenas. NGS makes great use of ITRF. So it's identical to the military system. Let's see. Oh, it's used to manage the NGS continuously operating reference system, or cores stations. It's almost like we're in the military with all of these all of these sets of letters and cores, ITRF, HARN. There's a lot of abbreviations to keep track of, right? So used to manage core stations. Let's see. The ITRF system is managed by the International Earth Rotation and Reference Systems. I'm not done yet. Get some room here. Rotation and Reference Systems Service, otherwise known as IERS. So it's very much an international cooperative system, right? Everybody kind of has their hands in the pot. So those are just a few of the more well-known horizontal datums that are in use. In fact, probably you could go through your entire career using just these horizontal datums until the new ones come out, which it's going to be an incorporated horizontal vertical system. So really, in a general sense, that's it for horizontal datums. As long as we understand what they are, so we can expand on them, I think that's probably enough information on horizontal datums and some of the specific realizations of that. So now we can start talking about vertical datums. And much like horizontal datums are used to communicate, measure, and explain horizontal systems, vertical datums are used to do the same, but in a vertical sense. So that's where we have benchmarks and that sort of thing. So the first one developed for the United States was the National Vertical Datum of 1929, or NVD 29. It's what we'll usually see. And it's quite a bit different than the vertical datum that we currently use. So it was based on 21 tide stations. Remember, vertical datums incorporate the idea of the geoid, and we're going to later on go into a little more detail about the geoid surface and look at how we relate the geoid surface to the ellipsoid and then to the terrain. So the 21 tide stations were used to develop a model for mean sea level, or MSL. So and that was developed over, so MSL was observed and tracked over 18 and a half years, 18.6 years. So all of the data from 18.6 years was used to devise a mean sea level. We also incorporated over 75,000 kilometers of leveling loops, of leveling. I mean, that 75,000 kilometers of leveling, I'm not sure how much experience you have with level loops outside of academia, but that's a lot of hours. That's a lot of labor hours to bring in that data to incorporate a nationwide network or an international network even of level loops to get elevations on benchmarks. So 75,000 kilometers. I just can't quite get my head around leveling that much. Must have been, I don't know how many people were involved in that, but anyway, the problem is that NAV or NVD 29 was insufficient. For geodetic purposes, and we'll talk about why. It was also flawed because mean sea level was considered to be, or defined to be, I'm going to say that, I like that better. Defined to be an elevation of 0.000 meters everywhere. Well, there's a problem with that because what the developers were trying to do was come up with a physical means by which we have we can define a surface of the geoid. And like we've talked about before, the geoid is not smooth. It has smooth subsets, but it's kind of lumpy. It's kind of, so the geoid, which we'll expand on later, it's sort of this amorphous blob, right? So giving a mean sea level an elevation of 0 meters everywhere is a problem because there can be, 50, 60, 100 feet of difference in elevation between one part of the world and the other part of the world for mean sea level. Now, that being the case, remember, that was NVD 1929. As technology advanced, we had, just like in horizontal systems, we had a greater need to incorporate an exact geoid model or a nearly exact geoid model. But the problem is because of the erratic shape of the geoid, we can't create a mathematical model to predict positions on the geoid. It has to be developed from empirical data or actual experimentation, measurements, observations of gravity itself. So along came NAVD88, which is what is currently in use for a vertical datum. So it's currently in use as the standard vertical datum. And since it is a North American vertical datum, how widely is it used? Well, it's used from Panama to the south to Alaska at the north. So it's used throughout North America, Canada, Mexico, Central America, and the development brought about a height modernization. So we were able to develop real heights from empirical data from field observations, not just level loops, but that the level loops were checked with GPS, and then GPS was also used to develop the height modernization. So height modernization. Essentially, what that means is that instead of being reliant upon NAD 27, that is, if you remember right, based on the Clark 1866 ellipsoid, which used just an assumed geoid height. It wasn't based, the geoid model used for NAD, or I'm sorry, I think I said 27, I meant 29. So NVD 29 was, you remember, just an assumed geoid. Well, now, because accuracy and precision had much more stringent requirements, we actually had to collect gravitational data and height data to develop a more realistic geoid from which to work. So that gave rise to gravity redefinition program by the NGS. Remember in the last lecture, I brought up that while horizontal datums are dependent upon an ellipsoid model with exact definitions, well, the vertical datums are dependent on the geoid for heights. So gravity redefinition program was necessary. And the gravity models are constantly being updated. Let's see. The development of NAVD88 attempted to, and continues to attempt to, define and refine a usable geoid. Usable geoid. Get my spelling right. And all of this gives rise to a question: what is a geoid? So the geoid, on which vertical datums are dependent, it's a gravitational model of the Earth's gravity field. And it's built on an equipotential gravity surface. So equipotential, what does that mean? So equal and potential. Equipotential means it's, let's see, it's, I don't want to say imaginary surface, it's a theoretical surface based on empirical data wherein every point on the geoid surface has the same magnitude of gravitational pull or gravitational force. The directions vary, which is what results in that lumpy sort of shape, but the magnitude or the extent of gravity that gravity has an effect is exactly the same. So we can give it a number, 9.86 meters per second squared, everywhere. And we'll talk more about that when we develop the geoid. So obviously the geoid is gravity based. So it's a theoretical surface. We can't stand on a geoid. And this is the part that's kind of counterintuitive. The geoid is a surface, it's a level surface. Which seems kind of odd because that undulating shape of the geoid, it doesn't look level, does it? But since gravity has the same magnitude everywhere, but differing directions, everywhere those vectors are perpendicular to the geoid surface. So that what we perceive as downhill or think of as downhill or uphill don't really have the same meaning. Here, you would expect water to, what you would expect is for water to run off and pool up in these little dips in the geoid. But in fact, water would spread equally because gravity is the same all throughout the geoid. And this is why a geoidal model that has 0 meters as an elevation everywhere doesn't quite work because the geoid itself has differing elevations with respect to a mathematical surface or an ellipsoid. So let's summarize everything we've talked about so far with datums before we get into further development of the geoid and before we get into discussion of conversions between datums. So in summary, change my pen color. In summary, let's see, we're talking about datums, which essentially is a reference surface. And that's made up of, it could be a point that is a center or multiple points along with the surface itself. Let's see, the horizontal datum is based on an ellipsoid. Whereas the vertical datum is based on a geoid. Let's see, we talked about, one thing we didn't talk about is a datum realization. So a datum realization is basically a checking and a refinement over time of a datum. So it's an update, I guess would be good. An update on a datum. Let's see, update using actual observations and empirical data. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have a mathematical model of the geoid? Then we wouldn't have to go to the trouble of making actual physical observations to keep updating our model. Empirical data. Which is why we have so many variations of datums. We have, for example, let's see, in WGS84, for example, we have realizations like the G730, for example, realization. And these descriptors, G730, refer to a date. G873 is another one. Realizations are temporal chapters of a datum development. So it's based on time. As time goes by, we have to keep updating the geoid models, the empirical data for laying out a reference frame. And so realizations are heavily dependent on empirical data. So WGS84, since they're time-based, we denote the date or the time that a realization was implemented through what's called an epoch. So an epoch essentially that's the time signature of, I'll put that in quotes, time signature of a datum realization. So we might have, say, for NAT83, for example, we would have NAT83 96, and the epoch would be 2000.000. So that's the epoch. Or we might have NAT83, which is currently in use, 2011. Epoch 2010.000, etc. So some of the horizontal datums that we talked about. We have NAD27, which uses the Clark ellipsoid of 1866. Remember, horizontal datums, I keep driving this home, but horizontal datums are based on ellipsoids, so there's always an ellipsoid associated with a datum. NAD83, which is GRS80 based. We have WGS84, which has its own ellipsoid. We have Harns. We talked about Harns. The state-by-state or regional, I guess I should capitalize that. The state-by-state or regional datums. And let's see, we have the ITRF, the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, which manages the CORS system, continuously operating reference system, by the NGS, which that's what drives our GPS data for the OPUS system. Let's see. I'll just say uses ITRF. So we talked about horizontal datums, vertical datums, and a third datum is a virtual datum. I call it a virtual datum. Whereas the horizontal and vertical datums to date have been based on empirical data, mathematical models, and they were physically realized by actual monuments in the ground, benchmarks, NGS control points, baselines. Well, now with the democratization and advancement of GNSS technology, we're moving more and more to an environment in which we're not even using those points in the ground. If you are familiar with doing surveying field work, you probably are not so much going out finding NGS control points and benchmarks, running level loops between them, traversing off of the NGS published control monuments. What's done in practice now almost entirely is going out, we set GPS points, we collect data, we either just use autonomous RTK information, or we will post-process the static data by sending it to Opus or using some post-processing software to come up with our own control coordinates, our own heights and our own ellipsoidal coordinates. So really what we're talking about now is we're moving more to what I call a virtual datum. Virtual datums. So with virtual datums, vertical and horizontal reference are simultaneous, meaning we don't make a distinction any longer between the vertical datums and the horizontal datums. They're incorporated into one model. Vertical and horizontal reference, I forgot what I was writing. Are simultaneous. As a result, NGS, because the practice is extremely costly to keep maintaining and updating these physical points in the ground, so NGS has stopped maintaining, for the most part. They're deprecating the physical monuments. Which sounds a little scary, but we really just don't use them anymore. I should say that they've stopped maintaining the physical network of monuments. Individual monuments will still be checked, maintained by the private sector as they use them, but even that is becoming less standard, and I think will kind of fade away into antiquity. Let's see, physical, I should probably finish what I was writing, huh? Network of monuments. And that includes benchmarks. Meanwhile, the online positioning user surface, and time for another acronym, but this one we all know or should know or will know. That's Opus. So meanwhile, online positioning user surface has mostly replaced the use of physical datums. I'll call them physical datums. So there we go. Opus uses Opus uses interpolation between core stations that we talked about to determine point positioning. Positioning. And that's where we are now. We are using Opus more and more and more to tie into NAT83 so we have a common reference frame to determine our coordinates. That way we can more easily, more readily share and communicate our own coordinate systems with others because they're all transferable through NAT83, as long as we're tied into published networks. So I think we'll stop there. That is a good stopping place before we move into really delving into and defining the geoid. And we're going to need to talk about geoid heights, ellipsoid heights, surface heights, and how they interrelate before we start moving into the vertical datum conversions. Vertical datums or horizontal datums can be converted between each other, sometimes not exactly, and usually not exactly for vertical in the vertical case, but we can use iterative processes to get a conversion that is sufficient within certain margins of error. Anyway, so again, more just informative talk, but pretty soon we'll start getting back into computations once we get the idea of the geoid under our belts. And that is it. Lighter stuff, just some of the nuts and bolts we have to get out of the way before we move forward into conversions. But hopefully we have a better understanding of what a datum is, how it differs from basic reference frames that we've been talking about all term, and I shouldn't say differs from, but utilizes and expands upon those reference frames. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Google is a great tool for understanding this stuff. I didn't even scratch the surface of all the information that's out there on datums, all the datums that are available, how they're used, how they're developed. This is just sort of a broad brush overview. With that, I will wish you a good day, and I'll see you next time.